Hi, I'm Matthew Kelly. Welcome. Great to be with you again. Today, my guest is Mike Aquilina, author of many books, man of many, many talents. We're going to focus on just a couple of those today. Mike, great to be with you.
Hey, great to be with you, Matthew.
You've had an incredible journey, but tell us a little bit about where did it start? Where did you grow up? What are the roots of your faith? Give us a little bit of a sketch around that.
I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, in a little coal mining town, and just about everybody in town was Catholic, and
Mm,
just about everybody in my neighborhood was descended from someone in one of three little villages in Sicily, and our parish was microethnic. It was built just to serve the descendants of those three villages in Sicily. If you were from another village, you better go somewhere else, right?
wow.
So that was my experience. My parents were saints. They really were. They're wonderful, wonderful, virtuous uh, people, and deeply Catholic. I don't know where it came from, but yeah, they were deeply Catholic, and they were well educated in the faith, and neither of them did advanced studies in anything, but they really, really knew their faith, and they lived it too.
Mm. And now you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I'm the youngest of seven. My
Okay.
parents my parents were 47 when I was born. And I was born in 1963. So I was born into a lot of tumult in the church. Everything
In
was
the
was
world.
rocking and rolling and changing. And I saw the way my parents navigated that. I also saw the way my schools navigated that, and it was quite a spectacle. There was a lot of excitement at the time, and
Yeah.
everything seemed to be swirling, and everything seemed to be up for grabs. Everything. It was a confusing time. It
Mm.
really was confusing, and I was utterly confused. And I was okay being utterly confused.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would say we're living in a confusing time today. Do you see similarities or differences between what we're experiencing culturally and what you're describing?
Well, I think that's true. I think that's true that we are living in a confusing time today. I the 60s was kind of the great emergence of the sexual revolution, for example. Everything was suddenly out in the open, let it all hang out, and that was a trying time. It
Mm.
was it was challenging all these social mores and relationships. We start to see divorce. This is unheard of. Uh, right now, though, I think that there's more of a sense of stability and certainty in the church. Now, I know that nobody younger than me will say that, but comparatively now is a sense of greater stability in the church,
Yeah.
because we're coming off uh, a great period of defining, right? Kind of describing once again for a new generation what are the rules, how are things working here. We have the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we have all those encyclicals that were so instructive, and the teaching of Pope John Paul II, who was a great traveler and came to our country repeatedly and spoke to us. Those were all great moments
Mm.
in the kind of the shoring up of the Catholic Church. So when I was a kid and into the 70s, there really wasn't much, for example, that you could call Catholic media.
Right.
Catholic television, it wasn't going on. It wasn't happening. There were a couple attempts at launching Catholic television. They didn't pan out. They lost a lot of money.
Right.
Same thing with publishing. Catholic publishing was not the juggernaut it is today. I know that if you're working in publishing, it may not seem to you like a juggernaut, but there's a lot of vitality. There's a lot of ferment going on right now, and there are a
Yeah.
lot more publishers. That makes it harder on all of us. We have to be more competitive. We have to be more creative. It's challenging, but that's a good situation to have. That's a really good situation to have. It's great to have television. It's great to have all the podcasts we have. I get excited thinking about our moment in history.
Yeah. It's interesting, like what was countercultural in the 60s is now mainstream.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Catholicism may be the most countercultural thing in our culture today, you know, and to really embrace it. So you've written a bunch of books,
I
so
have.
many great books. Um, we're publishing a few of them. I thought we'd start with Angels of God, and you know, it's a fascinating book. The subtitle is The Bible, the Church, and the Heavenly Hosts. Angels appear to be something that um, people misunderstand a lot, or just don't even think about it at all, even though they are constantly appearing in the Bible.
Yes.
Um, what were you hoping when you wrote this? What were you hoping that the reader would get from that and experience through this?
I wanted the reader to know that God intends for us to have a relationship with his holy angels, a relationship that St. Augustine dared to call friendship,
Mm,
amicitia. He wanted us to be friends with the holy angels, especially our guardian angel. God placed this creature in our lives. And every single one of the guardian angels is smarter than 1,000 Einsteins and stronger than the combined offensive and defensive lines of the Pittsburgh Steelers on a good Sunday. And this creature was made to take care of me and to get me to heaven.
mm,
That's mind blowing. So I think that's what I wanted. The book really came out of conversations with my acquisitions editor and she we were talking about family all the time. She and I, she and her kids and grandkids and me and my kids and grandkids. And so, we talked and for me, anytime I talk about any relationship, I bring in the guardian angels because for me, they're the key to communication within the family, within the workplace, wherever you go. And that's a lesson that I learned in the 90s and I never quite shook it. It's been very helpful to me in all of my relationships that
wow.
there are these angels whose specialty is communication. They're messengers. The Greek word angelos means messenger. And so they're messengers placed in your life and they want to get the message across. They want to help you to have good relationships. They want you to get to heaven.
Yeah. Were you taught the guardian angel prayer as a kid?
I was. I
Yeah.
was. And my mother had a deep devotion to the guardian angels. Unfortunately, I didn't pick it up as a kid. I really didn't pick up on it. And then, I went my own way in my teen years and through college and everything. And then life got disrupted when I had my first child.
Mm,
Because, I was going to be the greatest dad ever. Why? Well, because I went to a good school and I got good grades and I was really impressed with myself. So fatherhood, well, I'm gonna do this so much better than my parents. And then God gave us, my wife and me, God gave us this child who, has been laboratory tested and proven to be the most willful creature on God's green earth. And he really challenged us. He did not recognize my infallible teaching authority. He just didn't believe in it. And so he would challenge us all the time. He loved to argue. He still loves to argue. He's
mm,
34 years old. He loves to argue. So, so, um, so that was a challenge. I started going to confession a lot more, and I'd go to confession. I'd make his confession. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 1 week since my last confession, and I lost my temper 4 times. Let me tell you why. So my confessor 1 week just says, Mike. He just stops me midstream and he stops me. He says, Mike, Mike, Mike. Said my name 3 times. I remember it vividly. And he said, next time you see your son, I want you to do me a favor. Before you greet him, I want you to greet his guardian angel
mm,
because then it's three against one. It's
mm.
you and your guardian angel and his guardian angel against him, but you're not really against him. You're all trying to get him to heaven. And I followed that advice. And as far as I can see, it's the best spiritual advice or the most helpful spiritual advice I've ever received in life. I may be wrong about that. I'll find out something different when I get to my judgment, I'm sure. But right now, it seems like the most useful spiritual advice I ever got. And I really wanted people to have that same experience when they read Angels of God, that
Yeah,
book.
yeah. My grandmother taught me to, if you're going to have a meeting or you're going to have an encounter with someone and you think it's going to be difficult, or if you're negotiating a business deal, send your guardian angel to talk to their guardian angel, just like you spoke, because they're our friends,
Yeah.
but they're also friends with each other. Send your guardian angel to pave the way. It was a very, very powerful lesson for me. Do you have a favorite angel story in the scriptures?
Oh boy. Well, my favorite is when St. Peter is in prison, right? And the angel comes in the night, and Peter's double chained, and the angel just goes cling cling and knocks the chains off of him, right?
Yes.
And then something beautiful. The angel picks up his cloak and puts it on him. What a beautiful maternal move, right? I mean,
Mm,
that to me says this angel that you have loves you as much as your mother does, because that's what my mother would have done. Made
yep.
sure that I had my coat on before I went outside in the cold.
And
Uh,
cares for the the human as much as
yes,
the divine, and for
yes.
the physical needs as much as the spiritual need. That's great. I love that.
And then the way it ends is Peter goes out into the cold, goes to the house church, right? And knocks on the door, and it's answered by Rhoda, who's so shocked to see the first pope standing on her porch when he's supposed to be in prison getting ready to die, that she goes running inside and leaves him standing out there in the cold, right? And she says, Peter's out there, to the Christians who are inside, and they say, it can't be Peter. It must be his angel. And so
Mm,
you can see the devotion to the angels that
very
the
early.
first Christians had. They,
Yeah.
they they'd be surprised to see Peter. They wouldn't be surprised to see his angel.
Mm, fantastic. Love it.
Isn't it?
Love it. What let's talk about understanding the mass. 100 questions, 100 answers. I can't tell you how popular this book is.
That
I
makes me
can't tell
happy.
you. Everywhere I go, people ask me about this book, and I think it shows just an enormous desire that people have to understand the mass more. And
Yes.
um, when you wrote this book, what was the origins of it, and what were you hoping there?
Well, the origins of it were in, I guess, 2009, and the church was about uh, to launch that overhaul of the liturgy that happened back then. All right. So I wanted to write a book that would explain the things that were changing, right? So that people understood those, but understood them within the context of what the mass is in the first place. Because I think that's where the real problem is, that we have several generations now where most people just were not catechized very well. They
Yes,
did not get the message. And then they had, many people had an unstable family situation. So the truth does not become a priority in such a situation, and it gets muddied, right? Um, especially, you have family members who stop going to church and everything. You're trying to make sense of all this. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to do, is to bring people back to the mass, uh, uh, let them know what it is and all the details, and then try to anticipate the questions they have. Because really, we're asking them to believe something that seems unbelievable. How
yes,
could anything be so good, right?
yes.
Uh, and it just seems that way. And so I wanted them to understand what it is and why it is the way it is. So I did a walkthrough of the Mass. I talked about a lot of theoretical things in the book that arise in people's minds, and just some of the standard. Uh, I answered some of the standard apologetical questions, the challenges we get to our doctrine on the Mass from people who are not Catholic.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very, very powerful. And I think that, um, people do have their faith challenged by people. And when we don't turn around and find the answer to that question, those doubts begin to sow in our hearts and they begin to grow. And I
Yeah.
see this in people. And so I think it is very important that when our faith is challenged, when people do question something, we don't have to have all the answers,
Yeah.
but to be able to go places
Yes.
and find the answers so that that person's doubts don't get sown in our hearts is very, very important.
Yeah, you're
One of the things
telling
I
my
talked to, go ahead, please.
Yeah, you're telling my story. You're telling my story there. I was newly married, right? And I told you before, I grew up in a town where there were no Protestants. So I went away to college. The first Protestant I met, I married. Okay. That's only a slight exaggeration. But I married a Protestant girl, and she's my wife now. Uh, though she's no longer Protestant. But when we were first married, she was. And one day she asked me, "Can you tell me the difference between what you believe about Holy Communion and what I believe about communion?" And so I went and I pulled down two question and answer catechisms. I pulled down Luther's Small Catechism off my shelf because I had a copy, and I pulled down the Baltimore Catechism, and I read her the questions and answers in both places. And the the most amazing thing happened. She didn't say anything.
Mm,
She laughed. She laughed out loud. And I said, "What's so funny?" She said, "You don't believe that."
mm,
I said, "Of course I believe it." She said, "If you believe that, why do you only go to Mass on Sunday?"
wow.
I went to Mass the next morning, and I've been going every morning since then, except when I was hospitalized. I've been going every morning since then, and that was, boy, 35 years ago.
You married 35 years? Is that
I think, let me see, how many years altogether? I am married 39 years this year.
okay? Very good. What's it's a little bit of a detour, but what have you learned from 39 years of marriage, and what advice would you have to people who are just setting out on that journey?
Oh, hang in,
Yeah.
hang in. It always gets better, it seems. Like,
Mm,
that one of the saints said that eventually you'll even come to love your spouse's defects, the things that drive you crazy when you're young. And I've experienced that. I
mm,
find there are these things that drove you crazy when you were young, uh, and they become endearing over time. They
yeah.
become part of your beauty, and the things that make you distinctive, different, unique, gorgeous, and you come to see those things as gifts. Um, so that's one thing I've learned. I mean, I guess we could spend hours on that subject alone. I'm madly in love with my wife. I really am. If you don't believe me, you can go and read the books of poetry I've written that are published. They're out there, and you can see my most ardent expressions of my love for my wife. She's really
Beautiful.
wonderful. Yeah. She came into the
Beautiful.
church in after we've been married, I think about 6 years. So,
That's fantastic. That's a fruitful detour. If
mm,
we come back to understanding the Mass, one of the things I talk to people about all the time is that we prepare for everything we consider to be important. And I'm curious, how do you prepare yourself for Mass? How do you encourage other people to prepare themselves for Mass? Walk me through that a little bit.
well, there are different things you can do. Lots of people today don't like to hear this, but it can be helpful to dress up a little bit, right?
Yep.
Okay, and not going in the kinds of things you'd wear to the beach. And people today don't like to hear that. They want to be able to wear flip-flops anywhere, but you either live up to the respect you're showing through your dress, or you live down to it. It really is formative. What we wear really does form us. Uh,
Yes.
and and if we would not show up that way to a family wedding, for example, unless the
Yep.
wedding was at the beach, but but we would not show up that way to a family wedding. Why would we show up that way to the wedding feast of the Lamb? It's just not a good idea. So, you know, dress a little nice at least. You don't have to rent a tuxedo for Mass, but dress nice. Show up before Mass. Show up a few minutes early, if you can, to kind of um, adjust to the silence, your own silence, your interior silence, because we're so bombarded all the time by sensory overload. So the mass is going to be a little bit different. Go a little bit early so you can ease into it, and stay a little bit afterward too if you can, just to give thanksgiving and to think about how you're going to apply that mass once you get outside, once you get home, once you go back to work the next day. Uh, Lots of things we can do, and they're simple things. They don't require a lot of effort, and they don't really put us through any degree of discomfort. We like
Mm,
to whine about everything, but it's no really no great degree of discomfort.
yeah. What about you're obviously a wildly creative person. You must get distracted in mass, as we all do.
Mhm.
How do you deal with your distractions?
Just keep coming back to it. Just keep coming back to it. That's all. I mean, our Lord made us. He knows what makes us tick, and sometimes you can roll with your distractions in any kind of prayer and say, okay, why is that preoccupying me? And then you can say, I'm going to put that, whatever it is that's distracting me, whatever it is I'm thinking about, I'm going to put that on the altar and offer it as part of the sacrifice.
Yeah,
All of these things, these hardships, these little annoyances, they can all be sanctified, or they can bring us down. It's really our choice whether they're sanctified and whether they're sanctifying us, or whether they bring us down and bring us in the other direction.
yeah. It's interesting. Everything on the altar gets transformed, and it's amazing how little we put up on that
I
altar,
know, I know.
and it's one of the things that was very powerful teaching in my life. And I love that you talk about that in the book, and I love that you brought that up now. Um, do you have a favorite prayer in the mass or moment in the mass, or walk us through that a little bit?
You just named it. My favorite moment in the mass is the offertory,
Mm,
because there's so much that I love in life. There's so many people I love in life, and I try to use that time at the offertory to put each of them on the altar, right? To In my mind, in my heart, to put each of them on the altar. And I have a lot of concerns, regarding work, regarding the family, and so on. I can put each of those concerns on the altar. There's usually time for that. There's usually a song going on. The priest is kind of doing his business up there, and so you have time to do it. You have an opportunity to do it, and really, it's the moment to do it, because
yeah,
that's the moment when the gifts are landing on the altar. So they're arriving. All of your concerns are arriving with the gifts. That to me is the great moment in the mass. If I'm just talking about the psychological delight it gives me. You mentioned all those distractions. Well, things distract us sometimes because they bother us. Things distract us sometimes because they delight us. And so you're reminded of all these good things as well as these other things that are maybe weighing you down, but you're putting them all on the altar. These are the things that are near to your heart, near they're near to your mind at the moment.
mm. You mentioned family, and we published a couple of years back a great book by Alan Hunt called "Dreams for Your Grandchildren."
Yeah.
What what are your dreams for your grandchildren, and how do you approach your grandchildren? Or really, what advice would you have for grandparents around sharing the faith with their grandchildren?
Let yourself be surprised. One of the
Mm.
saints said, don't write the novel of your child's life. Don't write the novel of your grandchild's life. Let yourself be surprised by these children as they grow into themselves. We might have an idea of what they should be. We're almost always wrong, right? Uh, but you see these children and you watch them develop and you watch them grow into somebody so interesting, with their
Mm,
own fascinations, with their own preoccupations. And I find that most amazing. But my only advice to people for anything is greet the guardian angels of those children when you see them, whoever they are. Greet the guardian angels, so that even psychologically, you have an advantage there. You're supernaturalizing the conversation. You're bringing it up to another plane. It can be delightful on a natural scale. And you could be talking about something totally silly,
yeah,
something goofy. But even that act of delighting the child and the child delighting you is something holy. You've made it that way by making the offering. God did something amazing when he designed us the way he did, so that when we're baptized, we take part in his life. We become, St. Peter said, partakers of the divine nature. What does that
Mm,
mean? We're sharing in Jesus' office of priest, prophet, and king, right? So we make a real offering as a priest. It's an offering of sacrifice. And that's how we sanctify things. We make them holy. The other thing is that our children and grandchildren are also baptized into those offices, right? Presumably, or in most cases. And and so they're working that way in our lives. So these are things we can teach them. And they're speaking prophetic words to us because that's their role. Uh, and that's something, to be attentive to them because they are filled with the Holy Spirit since their baptism, and they play that role in your life.
yeah,
God, the Holy Spirit is working through them to reach you.
yeah. So powerful. What about some of my most powerful experiences of Mass have been on pilgrimage in different places around the world. And I know you have traveled broadly. Do you have a memory of a Mass somewhere abroad that you can share with us?
Yeah. It's actually several masses all in the same place. Whenever I take a pilgrim group to Rome, I try to go to Ostia Antica, which is a
Mm,
national park there, and the national park is just ruins of a 5th century city. Now, the interesting thing about it is you experience a typical city, like a ghost town from the 5th century, and you find yourself in antiquity. Like when you see the Colosseum, you say, "Wow, this is cool," but the Colosseum's weird. It's this 1st century superstructure that's a ruin in the middle of a major intersection in one of the great metropolis cities of the world, right?
yeah.
And it's weird. But Ostiantica is just this quiet place where you're in the ruins and you get to walk the streets that St. Paul walked. You walk the streets that Augustine walked. You get to walk the city where Augustine's mother, Monica, died. You get to
Mm,
see her tombstone there, right? So, all of these things that are going on there. Well, what we usually do is we go into the Basilica Church there, the ruins of the Basilica, and you can see how it was set up with the scriptures in one niche at the front of the church and the Eucharist in the other niche at the church, and the altar's no longer standing. But what we do is we go up to the niche where the Eucharist was and we have mass there. And
wow.
that to me, to worship in this basilica where Monica and Augustine worshiped and where Monica's funeral was, this is a powerful experience to me.
Yeah.
And usually before mass we'll have confessions, and while we have confessions, I'll just stand there to kind of drown out any sound, and I'll read from Augustine's confessions the scenes that are set in Ostia.
Wow. That's awesome. I knew I'd get a good answer to that question. It's just powerful mass in these places, the catacombs, Portiuncula in Assisi, um, out in the fields in Ireland, lots of great places. It's just so powerful. Greece, just amazing. But let's move to roots of the faith, from the
That's
church fathers to you. What's the origins of this one, and what was your hope for the reader?
Well, the origins there were mostly questions I've received from other people, like where does this act come from? Confession.
Yep,
Where does that come from?
yep,
And so what I do there is I usually begin in scripture and tell them how these things started. Script, and we can see it in the pages of the New Testament. Um, but then I go on to describe how these things continued and how they developed with experience in the life of the church. How confession, for example,
yep.
or how confession was um, was practiced in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, because it was an important part of the church's life. And there were often disputes about how it should be conducted, and some of those disputes actually threatened to divide the church in two. I want people to understand that these aren't peripheral acts, that these are important things in the church's life, because they'll be challenged on these things. Catholics
Yeah.
will be challenged on these things. Where is that in the Bible? You hear that often, and you say, well, it is in the Bible, and it's always been accepted by Christians. So I went through a whole series of things. What did marriage mean to the early Christians? How was that? How was it lived out? So I did that chapter by chapter, and I got a great response to it from a lot of people, and it's something that continues to do well for me these days, and do well because it does well for other people.
Yeah. It's powerful. You know, you've got the mass, you've got confession, you've got the scriptures, you've got the saints, you've got purgatory, the clergy, the papacy.
Yeah.
But chapter 8, I found chapter 8 interesting, Sex and the Sexes, because you published this book in 2010,
Yes.
so 14 years ago. I think chapter 8 is very interesting in light of, really prophetic in light of what is happening in our culture today. But the prophetic nature of chapter 8 goes all the way back to the fathers of the church.
That's right.
And I've found that to be fascinating. We live in a culture that is confused about sex, that's confused about the sexes. What is your observation of what's happening in our culture with that regard?
Well, even Christians are confused on a lot of these issues, and they're confused about their own history. They think, for example, that contraceptive birth control is something new, right? That the early Christians had nothing to say about it because it didn't exist. Well, that's just not true.
Right.
Same thing with abortion. Abortion was very common in the Greco-Roman world, as were so many of the perversions that we see today. With that chapter, I wanted people to know, there's nothing new under the sun. The early
Yes.
Christians dealt with these things. They spoke often about contraception, for example. They spoke often about abortion. Abortion is one of the moral issues that's most discussed in the earliest Christian literature. And in my opinion, well, and the evidence bears this out, I think, it was the first social justice issue to be taken
Mm.
on by the church and prosecuted with all the energy that was available. This was the most important thing to the first Christians,
Yeah.
that we have to get this culture out of this terrible practice. And so they leaned into it. And so I write about that there. I've written about it elsewhere. Even this idea of surgical altering of the body, that was done in the first century. Nero preferred his sex slaves to be surgically altered in certain ways. And
Mm.
it was the Christians who spoke out against these practices, and many others, like the unhealthy practice of child marriage and that sort of thing. The Christians spoke out against these things for the good of their people. It's very interesting that women were very vulnerable in those cultures, the pagan cultures at that time, very vulnerable, especially sexually. The very rich could pretty much have sex with the people they wanted to whenever they wanted to. More than half the people in the Italian peninsula were slaves, and you could rape
Mm.
a slave with impunity, right?
Wow.
So that's that world. It was a cruel world. It was a heartless world. One historian, who's not a believer, described it as a sexual paradise. Well, it was
Wow.
a sexual paradise for the 1% who could just treat it like their playground. For everybody else, it was miserable. And it
Yeah.
made for miserable lives, miserable marriages, miserable families. And that was so evident. The agnostic sociologist Rodney Stark said that the family doctrine of the Christians was the thing that was the engine of the church's growth. And it caused the church to grow at a rate of 40% per decade. 40% per decade for almost 300 years.
Wow. Wow. Very powerful.
We have the goods.
We do. We got the answers. We
Yes.
got history and mystery,
Yes.
and the answers to the questions. And
Yes.
I find it fascinating. You go to some of these Christian churches and you ask, well, what is your teaching on this? Whatever the issue might be, and they'll be, well, we don't have a teaching on that. And what is your teaching on this? Well, we don't have a teaching on that. But the church has a teaching on everything.
It
And
does.
you might not like the teaching,
Mhm.
but the answer isn't going to be we don't have a teaching on that. The answer isn't going to be we haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
And when we think about things as Catholics, we think very, very deeply about things, and it is really beautiful if you take the time to get into it. I have to ask, because I one thing I'm fascinated with is creative process,
Mhm.
and I talk to even people who are not creatives or would consider themselves not creatives about work process. Like, how do you approach your work? And because I think work process has an enormous impact on both the quality and the quantity of work that we produce. So I have to ask you, when you're sitting down to write a new book, what is your creative process around writing a new book?
I'm kind of dull. I'm kind of like a mule, right? And so for me, it I guess there's part of me that never wants to work. That always wants to get around to it later, right? And so a big part of my innards are resisting starting something, sitting down and gritting my teeth and doing it. And that's a big part of me. So I try to think of what I do in a priestly sense, right? And
Mm,
make the offering. Okay, so I tell people my keyboard is my altar, my desk is my altar, right? These are the surfaces on which I offer sacrifice, and if I do that, then I can lean into it, I can show up, and 80% of life, as Woody Allen once said, is showing up. If
mm.
you show up, you're likely to get something done. You're going, lean into it, and do it. Make the deadline. I I I think I think that everything we do also has a penitential aspect. I want to make reparation for my sins because I love God. I want to make it up to Him the way I make things up to my wife if I
Yes.
happen to offend her. I want to make things up to Him. So I try to do it now and do it well.
Yeah.
And I don't have like a mystical view of getting work done, creative work done. I know that a lot of people do, and they're right about a lot of the things they say. But I think of myself like a donkey.
Mhm.
I show up, I sit down. I know I don't feel like taking the next step, but I try to do it. I try to do it. Um, even if you say, okay, I'm not in the mood to write anyway. Write something bad.
Yeah.
You can clean it
Wait
up
till you're in the
later.
mood. You won't write anything. No,
That's
you
right.
won't do anything,
That's right.
or very rarely. Mike, it's been great to be with you. I hope you'll come back. We can have some more conversation.
Anytime.
It's really a great pleasure. And I know a lot of people will enjoy this conversation. God bless you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks again for having me on, Matthew. I really enjoyed the conversation, really enjoyed the time.
You're very welcome.